Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the sci-fi books that won both the Hugo and Nebula awards for Best Novel. Now, as two of the most prestigious awards in science fiction, any book that won both of these awards is an important part of science fiction history. However, which do I think you should prioritize most on your TBR? There are 26 novels that have won both of these awards, but in today's video, I'm going to be focusing on the 14 dual winners from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the reason for that is I haven't read as many of the modern winners, and that's because over time, the nature of these awards kind of shifted to include a little bit more fantasy, and as we all know, sci-fi is the best fi. So of these 14 classic sci-fi books, I've read 11 of them, and at the end of the video, I'll be letting you know my 3 favorites. And of the 3 that I haven't read, I want you guys to vote in the comments for which I should read next. So let's get into them, starting with Dune by Frank Herbert. So it's no surprise to see Dune on this list, but an interesting fact about Dune is that it was the first book to be awarded Best Novel at the Nebula Awards by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. In 1966, they debuted the award, and Dune was its first winner, Dune published in 1965, so it was the first book to have the opportunity to be a dual winner at the Hugo and Nebula Awards. The Hugos starting in 1953, presented by the World Science Fiction Society at Worldcon, so there are a few earlier Hugo winners, but Dune, the first book with the opportunity to do both, and it did so. So Dune, I love Dune, Dune is great. I know it's kind of the golden boy of science fiction. I'm going to say science fiction. The fantasy people keep on trying to steal Dune from us. We need to hold on to it. You guys have, or you already have Lord of the Rings, all right? Let Dune be ours. For me, it's not quite my number one. I don't love it as much as the Dune superfans, but I do really like it, and I'm actually currently reading the series. I recently finished Children of Dune, as well as Dune Messiah, of course, book number 2, and I really like those, and I'll be reading God Emperor of Dune this month, which I know it's a little bit polarizing, but some people say it's their favorite in the series. So it'll be interesting to see how that, as well as the final 2 books in the series, compare to Dune for me. But I'm a fan. It's Dune. You gotta read it. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this is the only book I've read from Le Guin so far, although I do own a copy of The Lathe of Heaven, so I plan on reading that one pretty soon. And I can see why this book was so influential. In the 60s, it was definitely pushing the boundaries, proposing some new ideas, quite a revolutionary and influential sci-fi book. Although for me, reading it fairly recently, it lacked a little bit of punch. It didn't seem quite as new and fresh to me as it perhaps might have felt to readers at the time, and it was just a little bit slow. I kind of struggled to connect to the characters and the plot, although I do think there are some worthy themes to be explored in there. So while it might not be at the top of my own list, it's one that I still recommend, especially to fans of soft sci-fi that want to dig into some social sciences. Ringworld by Larry Niven. So this is one of the 3 books on the list that I haven't read, although I have read The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, and that's a very worthwhile book to read if you are a fan of aliens that truly feel alien. The Motes are one of my favorite alien species in all of science fiction, and it's worth reading for that alone. There are some other interesting aspects to that novel, although I felt like the plot and some of the ideas kind of petered out a little bit towards the end for me, but there was enough there that I am interested in reading more from Larry Niven. Ringworld, obviously a very famous and successful book of his, so let me know how much you think I'm going to enjoy that one. The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov. So The Gods Themselves is split into 3 parts, and I really like the premise that was set up in part 1. In the future, Earth gains access to a limitless energy source that is provided to them through a parallel universe. So there's some really cool concepts at play here. But unfortunately, for me, part 2 started to get pretty weird. It started to get a little bit confusing, and to me, it felt like Asimov was showing off a little bit. Look how clever I am. I bet this wins a Hugo, and credit to Asimov, it did end up winning both the Hugo and the Nebula, but that part didn't really work for me. And then I liked part 3 a little bit more, but it didn't fully deliver on the premise set up in part 1, and I felt a little bit disconnected from the book at that point. So I am a fan of Asimov. I'm currently reading The Caves of Steel, and that's my 7th Asimov book. So I do enjoy reading some Asimov, but The Gods Themselves to me is probably towards the lower end of my own personal Asimov ranking. So definitely worth checking out. Asimov, a highly important writer in science fiction, but I'm not putting this one at the top of my list. Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. Rendezvous with Rama has another great premise where humans find a cylindrical-looking object out in space and they go off on an adventure to explore it. So this does a great job, as Clarke pretty much always does, of capturing your sense of wonder, that mystery, the epic scale of the universe, what is out there, and there's some really interesting visuals that he describes, some physics that he explores, and I had a great time with this one, even though it does get a tad dry just at times. And when it came to the ending, there are some Clarke books that just absolutely blow me away. I was mind blown reading the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Childhood's End. Rendezvous with Rama is more of a thinky one. It's one that you ponder and it kind of stays with you, and I've grown to appreciate it more over time. I like the ending a little bit more now, the more I've thought about it, because it has stuck with me since I finished reading it, but I wouldn't quite put it at the top of my Clarke list just because I didn't get that thrill, that excitement that some of those other books gave me. But I am a fan of Clarke, and I am a fan of Rama. The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this is the second of the 3 books on the list I haven't read yet. As I mentioned, I've only read The Left Hand of Darkness by Le Guin so far, but I do want to read The Dispossessed. And what's interesting is that the full title is The Dispossessed: An Ambiguous Utopia. And I don't know, I haven't read the book yet, but just guessing, as the sci-fi reader, not a utopia. Pretty much any book where the world is set up as a utopia usually ends up really being a dystopia, but I don't know. Maybe it truly is ambiguous. I'll have to read and find out whether it's somewhere in between the two. But it sounds like something that Le Guin does well, focusing on society, relationships, politics, government, power dynamics, all that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting when I dive around to, mixing up my metaphors. Just like utopia and dystopia, maybe this is a mix. When I dive into that, quite soon. The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. The Forever War is a staple in the military sci-fi subgenre, with Joe Haldeman using his real-life experiences as a soldier in Vietnam and combining those with some interesting ideas to do with time dilation and battles with aliens, and also including some interesting things about people and relationships that I quite enjoyed as well. So I think this book does a few things really well. I think there's some great battle scenes, and I think the lead up to the battle scenes are really good as well, sort of putting you in the place of a soldier, the anticipation, the nerves, the sort of the power structure of a military unit, and combining that with some interesting futuristic technology. I really enjoyed sort of exploring that world, and it also kind of made me care about some of the characters and relationships too. So this is definitely a strong entry on the list, and if you enjoy military sci-fi at all, you definitely have to check out The Forever War. So we're halfway through the list, and just before we get to the next book, if you want to join some discussions on sci-fi books, award-winning or otherwise, check out the links in the description to my Discord server, as well as Patreon memberships. At the end of the video, I'll actually be spinning the Quantum Wheel in order to find out the Patreon pick for the month of August, so stick around to the end of the video for that. Gateway by Frederick Pohl. Gateway is an interesting novel, as it is less about interaction with aliens as it is interaction with alien artifacts. So humans find some remnants from an alien civilization known as the Heechee, and there's a bit of a mystery there. Some characters go on a bit of an adventure to try and learn more about their technology and them as a species. And then the book also combines that with some rather introspective chapters, as our main character goes through some therapy talking to an artificially intelligent therapist. So this book is very new wave, for better or worse. I think there are some interesting aspects that it explores, but I felt a little bit conflicted about this one because I kind of struggled with the main character. There were times where I empathized and rooted for them, and then there were times where I just could not stand them, and it really made it hard for me to get as invested in the book that I wanted to. So this one's worth checking out, especially if you are a fan of new wave, because this is very new wavy. Dreamsnake by Vonda McIntyre. So this is the third and final book on the list that I haven't read yet. I have read all of the other 11 books. So you guys are going to have to let me know, should I pick up Dreamsnake? I did read up on this one. I have heard of it before, and sounds intriguing, but maybe a little more fantasy. I don't know. You guys are going to have to convince me how sci-fi this is. I do like the title. Dreamsnake is kind of a sick title. So let me know, how much do I need to prioritize this one on my TBR? The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke. Another dual winner from Clark here, and The Founders of Paradise follows a couple of different storylines. The main one being that humans in the future are trying to build a tower up into space. And one of the other stories we follow is set thousands of years earlier, where a king builds these pleasure gardens. So there's some parallels there, and what I liked about this book was it dives into some of the technical aspects, the science of such an enormous feat of engineering, what an accomplishment that would be, but then also some thematic explorations to do with man's place in the universe and humans reaching for the stars, whether that is a positive thing or perhaps folly for us to be pursuing. So I enjoyed this one. There were a few tense moments. I connected with some of the themes. I'm not sure if it hit constantly the same way some of my favorite Clark books did, but it was pretty close. I am a pretty big fan of The Founders of Paradise and highly recommend it. Startide Rising by David Brin. Startide Rising was an interesting reading experience for me because this is set in the future, it's a space opera, and there are different alien species that are all intelligent. However, a species can only become intelligent if it is uplifted by another species, which begs the question, who uplifted mankind? So there's this great mystery there, and I liked some of the themes being explored there to do with your responsibility or your obligation to either help another species or maybe stay out of another species' affairs. However, I felt a little disconnected from this book because there were so many characters, there were so many things going on, we bounced around so quickly between them that I think I never really became invested. I feel like things didn't really peak and climax in a satisfying way. It was always just moving on to the next thing, and it spent a lot of time on random stuff like dolphin poetry, a lot of dolphin song lyrics in this book, and just sort of kind of cool things about sci-fi maybe in theory, but I didn't really connect with them while actually reading them on the page. I didn't have the most enjoyment while reading those parts of the book. So one that I was pretty mixed on. It's a unique book, an influential book, one that I think is worth checking out, but not near the top of my list of own personal favorites. Neuromancer by William Gibson. So this is the grandfather of cyberpunk, one of the most important and influential books in all of science fiction, and one that a lot of new readers to sci-fi pick up because it's so famous. It's the classic cyberpunk novel, but I don't think it's that easy to get into. When I read Neuromancer, I found it to be quite confusing. There were parts of it that I thought were super cool and interesting, but I was fairly confused a lot of the time. Gibson doesn't really hold your hand with the world building, and a lot of things only made sense to me after I finished reading the book, when I did a little bit more research, went online, read more about Neuromancer in order to put some of those puzzle pieces together. So while reading it, it wasn't one of my favorite books of all time, but definitely one that I've grown to respect and appreciate more over time. And usually I would recommend reading the influential book first and then reading the books that came after it so you could see how it was influenced by the original. But if you are newer to the genre, I maybe wouldn't recommend starting with Neuromancer. Maybe read some other modern cyberpunk books first, and then when you get a little bit of a handle on the genre, on the tropes, you can then go back to Neuromancer, see where it started, and see where those influences came from. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. So this is another staple in the military sci-fi subgenre, although this time we follow some younger characters as some talented children are recruited to a battle school in order to be trained up to be commanders in a fight against an alien species. And I am a massive fan of Ender's Game. I see why it has become one of the most beloved books in science fiction because it has such a great story. It follows a really great narrative arc with one of the best endings in all of science fiction, and I really connected with the characters and the themes as well. Ender and Shadow, and there's just so many great characters here that had a lot of personality and really dive into some interesting themes. Even though I think this book could be read by a young audience, sometimes people refer to this book as YA, I think you could enjoy this book on a certain level as a young reader. But I also think it's quite philosophical, and I think there are things to be gained on a reread. If you already read this when you were young, if you were to pick it up again as an adult, I think there would be even more that you could get out of it. So definitely going to be near the top of recommendations from me when it comes to this list. Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. So this is the first author on the list with this accomplishment in back-to-back years. And you might think that would make sense. Okay, book 1 in a series was loved by the voters, book 2 in a series was loved by the voters. But the thing about Speaker for the Dead is it is completely different to Ender's Game. In terms of style and tone, the way it reads, it is a pretty massive departure, and that can be good or bad depending on what you are looking for in your science fiction. So for me, as someone that loved Ender's Game, well, I did end up liking Speaker for the Dead. I was a little bit surprised at first. It was very slow, it was even more philosophical, there was a little bit less of a driving plot, a little bit less action, and it really just takes its time diving into the themes. And it's an interesting world and some worthwhile themes to explore, but if you didn't expect that change, you might be a little bit surprised reading it after Ender's Game. So, while I do like this one, and I think the bit of a slow burn does pay off in the end, for me it is slightly below Ender's Game on my list. So those are the 14 classic sci-fi books that won both the Hugo and Nebula awards. But the question is, which were my 3 favorites? Well, I'm going to give a gold, silver, and bronze medal. The Olympics are going on right now, so let's get into the spirit of it with my sci-fi version of it. And if you're watching this video in the future and the Olympics are long done by then, it'll still make sense. I don't think anybody's out there going to be thinking, what is this gold medal you speak of, Jonathan? I've never heard of such a system. I think you guys will get on board. So, without any further ado, in the bronze medal position, I'm going to give it to The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke. A very worthwhile addition to Clarke's bibliography that I read recently. I don't know if I'd put it above Childhood's End, which is my #1 Clarke book, but a worthy winner of the bronze medal. For the silver medal, I'm going to award that to Dune, the golden boy, the golden book of science fiction is my silver medalist. I'm a very big fan. Deserved medal winner, but there's one that I like even more, and that is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. One of my all-time favorite sci-fi books, award winner or not. I'm a huge fan of Ender's Game, and it is my gold medalist. So there you go. Those are my favorites. Let me know your favorites in the comments, and the 3 that I haven't read yet, I want you guys to vote in the comments, and I'll pick up a copy of whichever book wins your vote. So there you go, guys. Those were my favorites. And just before we go, I'm going to spin the Quantum Wheel in order to find out the Patreon pick for the month of August. Welcome to the Quantum Wheel, where all of the Patreon picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Well, let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of August. Will it be an award-winning Quantum Wheel spin? Let's see what it decides. Could it be Pushing Ice or The Speed of Dark? It's Pushing Ice! Hangs On. There you go, Alistair Reynolds, one of my favorite authors, a standalone of his that I haven't read yet, I haven't got to, so I'm excited about this one. If you're a space opera fan, you're a Reynolds fan, you like that medium to hard sci-fi space opera, join me in the month of August with Pushing Ice. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, and the award-winning Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.